Well, hello and welcome to this broadcast. What I actually did was turn the camera on because I have a phone hookup, a camera going. I was going to do an Instagram thing. Boy, I was really ambitious today. But what really is going on is I wanted to get a message out. And I was just kind of talking before I turned the camera on, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. That this morning I woke up and first thing that came to my mind was a quote from the book of Esther. And it says, "Who knoweth whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And I really didn't understand what that meant. Then I got up and I started thinking about some things and looking over some of my thoughts and what's been going on the last couple of days. And what happened on Friday, or actually on Thursday, I was teaching in a school here locally in Colorado Springs, and they made an announcement that the next day, Friday, would be the last day of school for 2 weeks, that they were going to take a break because of the coronavirus. And so I came back. I also had a job the next day teaching there. And so I was there at school and I was going through the classes. And one of the classes ended, and there was one girl left in the room. She was walking out. And I just said, "What do you think about all this? Or what do you students think about all this?" And she said, "Well, some are pretty scared. And I don't know what it means or what it's all about. But it'll certainly be something I can tell my children in the future." And I thought that was a pretty positive outlook, an adventure that she could share with her children later on about what happened back in 2020. So I've read a lot of things and looked at different sources. I try not to get too deep into it because it's pretty negative, some of the things. But I am happy for the people who have put a positive spin on some things and that have presented different ways of thinking rather than panic and fear. And that's really what I want to do here as well, because who knows if we're called for such a time as this to share a positive spin on it and a positive outlook so that people could declare protection and victory and different things that God has provided for us. So that's kind of my thought process, because this generation that we are in right now and the children that are in the schools right now that I teach and coach football with and teach during the week, they've never seen anything like this. They've never seen a panic or a scare or anything on this magnitude. And I don't even know if they really know what the magnitude is right now. In the early 1900s, from about 1900 to 1940, somewhere in there, there was the major flu epidemic, and the polio epidemic was then the first one, and we didn't even have a vaccine against it, and nobody even knew how you caught it. It was like it would hit one family and not another family, and people were scared and frightened, and even President Roosevelt, as a young man, he contracted polio and was paralyzed. And as I was growing up in the 50s in the schools that I were in, I knew several families who either a parent had had polio during that epidemic or one of the children had had polio and been affected by it. So it was a very real thing, and then in the 50s, the polio vaccine and the salt vaccine came along, and people were taken care of, and it was, it moved on to other things. But since then, we've had different epidemics that have come along, different panics, the avian flu, the swine flu, and now this coronavirus. And our country is somewhat insulated because it is isolated from a lot of the world around us, but it still affects us, and it's starting to affect more and more. Empty shelves in some of the stores that I've seen, and in Walmart, which is surprising because they're a major supplier, but people have, make runs on different things that they think are important, but that just builds even more panic and more desperation in a lot of people. And so I put the title on this of "In God We Trust." And I looked that up this afternoon as I was putting some of these notes together. And as I'm doing this, I got to be careful on the video because if I lower my head to read, all you're going to see is my shiny top, bald head. So I got to keep my head up so you don't get that glare. But the writing on "In God We Trust," it was the official motto of the United States, or is the official motto of the United States, and was adopted by Congress in 1956. It used to be "E pluribus unum," which you see on some of the coins that we have, which originally meant back in the colonies, out of many, one. It's Latin for out of many we become one, which is great, but I really like that concept of "In God We Trust." Put on our currency, put on coins, put on a lot of things so that we can constantly see that and be reminded of that. So that's kind of the point of this presentation of what I want to do today is to look at it from the standpoint of "In God We Trust," and cover some of the thoughts behind that. Panic has obviously already started in the stock market, which has dropped considerably, and financial unrest, and entire cities shut down in different parts of the globe, in China, Italy, and different places around the world. There's nobody walking the streets. Everybody is hiding in their house, afraid of one thing or another. But, I think we just, at this point in time, we have to take a deep breath, and we have to remember 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And we have to understand that. And as a nation, as more and more people say things, we can spread that kind of confidence and that kind of message to people all around us. In God we trust, and take a little deeper look at that. And the first part we look at is even in the physical body. In the physical body that God gave us, He built our immune system with so many different ways that our body can fight the infection, any infection, with the T cells, with the immune cells, with all these things that are designed within our blood structure to build up immunity against anything. So the first line of defense there really is to look at this concept and realize God prepared us for everything. And beyond that, there's even more that we can do within the spiritual realm, physical realm, to continue to promote health and well-being for all of us. This is not this thing that's happening. Some people want to ignore it or make fun of it and pretend it isn't happening. I never want to do that. But I also never want to just jump on a bandwagon and start getting everybody to panic and think that, you've got to live in fear. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Again, as I was talking about that thing I thought about this morning, if you understand the background behind the book of Esther, this king, who was basically a king of all the ruling world at that time, a lot of it anyway, it went from Egypt to India. So that's a massive growth spot if you look at that. In that area, this king was, a big deal. And he had a wife that offended him somehow, and he got rid of her. And so all of his supporters and buddies said, well, let's go round up all the great beauties of the area of the kingdom and bring them to the king and see who he wants to be queen. Well, there was this Hebrew girl, this Jewish girl named Esther. And she happened to be the prettiest girl in that region. So she was brought in, and to make a long story short, there was a process of elimination. It took a long time, and she finally made it as his queen. But being this kind of king, he had a lot of things to do, and she wasn't always around. And so somebody in the kingdom, it's a guy named Haman, set up a death march or a death sentence against the Jews because he was offended by the Jews. He not knowing that Esther was a Jew herself and from that Hebrew lineage. set up this declaration to kill all the Jews on a certain day. So Esther's uncle Mordecai went to her and said, "You got to go to the king and tell him what's going on." And she said, "Well, he hasn't called me in a month, 30 days. And if you walk in unannounced, you can be killed." And so Mordecai says to her, "Who knoweth whether you are called to the kingdom for such a time as this?" One voice, one time in a very dire situation that made a great deal of difference. So if you want to see the rest of the story, go read the book of Esther. It's pretty short and it's pretty fabulous. But that thought was what I considered today. Oh, we can be like that voice of Esther at a time when people need something to trust in, something to believe in, something to boost them up and to help them feel more secure about what is going on and what is happening in the world around them. And, this is where we can have impact. Just one person can have tremendous impact. Because, I talk about all those that immune system that God gave us, which he did and which we have. But the number one enemy to that immune system is stress and fear. Stress, fear, and panic suppresses the immune system and makes us vulnerable to things from the outside. But love, trust, and peace elevate the immune system. So just from a physical standpoint alone on how the body works that God created, that gives us an edge if we can remember that love, trust, and peace bring us in a state of elevated immunity. And, we can definitely start to use that to our advantage. So being able to guard your heart and guard your mind, as it says in Proverbs, with all diligence, to be able to take advantage, first of all, of what God just gave us inherently in this body, to be able to have a boosted immune system to fight off all these things from the outside. And then to think about God's protection in a larger view, a larger point of view. In Psalm 118, there's a great verse that David says, and people quote it all the time, but they kind of quote it out of context. The verse says, "This is the day which the Lord hath made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it." And I've heard people make songs of it and read it and say, "Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? Doesn't that just, isn't that lollipops and unicorns, and four-leaf clovers and all kinds of wonderful childlike innocence?" But what they don't do is they don't realize when he said this, what actually was going on. David was in a mess. David was in a lot of trouble when when he said this. I'll read you some of the context of Psalm 118. And it says, "I give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, because his mercy endureth forever. Let Israel say now, this is that his mercy endureth forever. Let the house of Aaron now say that his mercy endureth forever. Let them now that fear the Lord say that his mercy endureth forever. I called upon the Lord in distress." David was in distress. Okay. "I called upon the Lord in distress. The Lord answered me and set me in a large place. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear what man can do unto me. The Lord taketh my part with them that help me. Therefore shall I see my desire upon them that hate me. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust the Lord than to put confidence in princes." And that means governments, ruling authorities. "All nations compassed me about, but in the name of the Lord I will destroy them." This was a time when everybody was against him and he was having to fight wars on all fronts. "They compassed about me like bees. They are quenched as fire of thorns. For in the name of the Lord I will destroy them. Thou hast thrust sore at me that I might fall, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and song, and is become my salvation. The voice of rejoicing and salvation is in the tabernacles of the righteous. The right hand of the Lord doth valiantly. The right hand of the Lord is exalted. The right hand of the Lord doth valiantly. I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord. So then you get a few verses later, this is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. So again, it wasn't all sunshine in David's life at that time when those things were going on. He had to deal with a lot of obstacles, but still, that was his mindset, that God is here, God is going to help, God is going to take care of these things. So, his declaration in the midst of all that trouble, that's the situation that we want to exhort people to be in, the situation that we want to be in. You know, a few years ago, I did a lot of work on a section in the book of Psalms, Psalm 91. It's called the Soldier's Psalm. It's called, I forget, it's called, given a couple of different references, because it talks about trusting in God in very serious and dire circumstances, and what God will do, and what God will bring to pass. And in Psalm 91, just from the King James, it says, He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. Now that's a pretty simple verse, not much elaboration to it or even imagery to it. But what I did, I went through a process called expanded literal translations. And what that means is taking the words that are in the scriptures that God wrote in the scriptures, like that verse that I just read you, finding out what the meaning of the behind those words would be. Because it talked about the Almighty, and it talked about dwelling in the secret place of the Lord, and different terms referring to God. In the scriptures, there are numerous words used for God, and I'm going to share some of those with you in a minute. And each one of those words means something else. Each one of those words has an elevated meaning to it, something that is more powerful and expanded than just what you read. You know, you read the word Almighty and you don't think about that very much. It's not very vivid. But when you understand what that word means, that it's the word El Shaddai, and when you see the definition, the expanded definition behind that word, El Shaddai, it has a very powerful perception. So let me read you what actually this Psalm 91 says as you expand it in the way that God wrote it, using words that were to be impactful and powerful in our life. So verse 1 says, He that sits down and is still in the secret hiding place, known only to the initiated ones, that place which is in the very presence of the Most High God Elyon, who is the possessor of heaven and earth, the one who divides the inheritance, the God who dispenses his blessing to his own. That individual shall spend his days and nights lodging under the wings of defense of the Almighty God, El Shaddai, the God of all bountiful grace, and Almighty God who exercises his power to supply all needs for all his people. I mean, just that one verse alone, let's just close it and go home. I mean, when you see the context of the word Elyon, that term Elyon referring to God, it means Elyon is the possessor of heaven and earth, the creator and possessor of all things, possessor of heaven and earth, who divides the inheritance, our God who dispenses his blessings to his own. That's what the word Elyon means. So that's who you're associating with. That's whose wing you're hiding under. It says that individual shall spend his days and nights lodging, not just visiting, lodging under the wings of defense of the Almighty God, El Shaddai. And the word El Shaddai means the God of all bountiful grace, the Almighty God who exercises his power to supply all needs for all his people. Again, that verse alone, just holding to what it says right there, what else do you need? Where else would you go? What else do you have to understand to really be fully blessed and protected? And yet God goes on for 16 verses in this Psalm 91, explaining, all of his wonder and all of his majesty and all that he has, so that by the time you get through this process of these 16 verses, how could you not trust in God? How could you not be, without fear and bold and courageous and confident that God is able to do what he says, that God will do what he says? So we've seen two names, Elyon and El Shaddai so far. And then most people are used to the word Jehovah. But if you look in the details of the word Jehovah, especially if you look in the index or the back part of the Bullinger Bible, he's got, I think it is 10 or 12 different names that are attached to the name Jehovah. And each one means a different thing. And Jehovah is actually God's relationship to his people, and each explanation that's tagged onto that name Jehovah has a different meaning, has a fuller meaning, a broader meaning. Well, verse 2 in Psalm 91 says, I will say, Jehovah, my God, who has extended his promises to me. He is my refuge, a shelter, protection from danger of distress, a place for help during difficulty. He is my fortress, my castle, my strong place, my Elohim, the supreme creator. In him will I confide in and live with no fear in the strong city of my mind. I mean, that is a fabulous concept. I mean, there are many different places that God talks about the strong city of your mind. In other words, holding the vision and the truth of who he is and what he can do for you, so that it reaches our heart and manifests itself in believing. Here's verse 3 is pretty sweet. It says, surely he, God, shall snatch us out and take us away from the snares of the ensnarer, designed to bring calamity and decay into our lives and deliver us from all things. I mean, how beautiful is that? There are traps set out in the world, snares by the ensnarer, laid for us to step into, to get caught so that he can capture us. And it says that God will snatch us, not just take us, but, the intensity of it, snatch us out and take us away from the snares of the ensnarer. Verse 4, he, our God of so many names, and I think I might have added that in there, but you see we've already got 3 or 4 that we've seen so far. But he, our God of so many names, shall cover you with his feathers and wings of protection and security, so that you can confidently take shelter in his refuge. One of the references I read was how, I think it's a swan or animals like that, maybe chickens do it too, but they were talking about a bigger bird that would, all the little ducklings or little, I forget what they call babies of swans, but they would come and gather under the wing, and the wing would close down. I even saw a beautiful picture of a bird like that with the wing covering the little babies underneath its wing. So what a beautiful, vivid imagery that thing is. His feathers and wings of protection and security, so that you can confidently take shelter in his refuge. His truth shall be your outer shield, providing all his favor of life, mercy, security, remembrance, and salvation, as well as being your individual cover so nothing can harm you. With a statement like that, depending on how much you believe God, how big you believe God is, and how much you believe God can do for you, with a statement like that, where God is telling you what he will do and how it will work, how could there be any fear? How could there be any mistrust? How could there be any doubt of our security and our protection, our favor, our mercy, all that he says? Verse 5, thou shalt not revere, submit, or subject your minds or hearts to the mental terror or dread of the literal nighttime, nor physical threat of the literal day. Now, it took me quite a while to work through this from the verse that was in King James, but that's literally what it means. There are two verses here, verse 5 and verse 6, and one talks about the literal threats, and the other talks about the figurative threats. And the figurative threats would be the things that come up in your mind, the fears that we get in our minds, the fears that aren't, they're not real at the moment, but they're surely real enough for us in our minds and hearts because we've thought about them. We've dwelt on them, we've imagined them, we've put them in our minds like that. So here he's saying he's covering all bases, whatever you could, the literal threat of the night, which is kind of dark and scary and you can't really see everything, and the literal threats of the day, somebody right in your face. Somebody saying, well, there's another outbreak of the coronavirus in your city today. Okay, that's a literal threat. Somebody is actually in the hospital because of that. So that's a literal thing. But then the figurative thing, well, what if I go see this person and I catch it? What if I go to this meeting and I catch it? What if I shake somebody's hand and I catch it? Those are all figurative things. They haven't literally happened, but we think about them. So God covers, he says, the physical threat of the night, the dark and scary, the physical threat of the day, the bright and in your face, as well as, he says in the next verse, that you shall not revere, submit, or subject yourself to the unseen decay of the figurative dark night. In other words, your dark night fears, nor the real physical threat of the figurative daylight. You're conscious of when you're consciously aware and you go, I shouldn't be around that person. I shouldn't be around that person. Now, obviously, you're going to be smart and you're going to do, like they say, wash your hands, clean yourself up. But to walk around, hiding in or not even walking around, hiding in your closet because you're afraid to see anybody, talk to anybody, look at anybody, because you're afraid something's going to happen, those are figurative. And he covers in verse 5 literal, real things that happen, and in verse 6, figurative things that happen. So real and imagined, all covered. Do not give in to them. And that's where he says in verse 7, 1,000 shall be cast down at thy side, and 10,000 shall drop down at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. And I think this is where the soldiers, that are in battle, why they look at this psalm and they trust God in this perspective to watch over them. Verse 8 says, only thine eyes shall behold and see the reward of the lawless who despise the order that God has set up. Verse 10, yes, you will only see it because thou hast made Jehovah, the God who was, is, and ever shall be, unchanging and almighty, because you have made him your shelter and protection from danger or distress, a help in time of difficulty. Because thou hast chosen even the Most High Elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, to be your habitation and dwelling place. Because of these things, you are safe. So where do we put our hearts and minds? Where do we? It's not talking about running to a building, um, but being in the presence of God, being in that arena of God's heart and love and compassion for us, aligning ourselves with Him, trusting in Him because of all of these things. There shall no wicked or injurious nature, which is designed to break up all that is good in your life, come upon you. That's verse 10. Neither shall any physical attack be allowed to come near you when you are dwelling in the Lord's presence. Verse 11. For he, the God of so many names, again, shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways. Verse 12, they, God's angels, shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. Now, if that sounds familiar, this is part of the temptation that Satan gave to Christ when he met with him there at the beginning when Jesus declared his ministry. Satan quoted these verses. Well, you can jump off this cliff or jump off this temple, because doesn't it say that God gave his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways? And his angels shall bear thee up, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone? The only thing that's kind of ironic about quoting that particular verse is the next verse in 13, which says, I stretched it out again, making it literally what it was saying there. As it promised in Genesis 3:15, Christ's foot shall bruise Satan's head. He shall tread upon the powerful lion who attacks physically, and the serpent who tries to poison him subtly, and the dragon who tries to attack him spiritually. All shall be trampled under his feet, and since we are in his body, they are all under his feet, our feet as well. That takes a little more explanation as to how I came up with that literal expansion on that, which, maybe I'll do it sometime. But if you understand that and you look at it, then you can see the depth of it from beginning to end, how we are protected. And verse 14 says, and this is where it shifts, as the writer, which a lot of people attribute this to Moses. I'm not sure if it's Moses, David. I'm not completely sure on that. It doesn't matter. But the writer is writing this first part. And then in verse 14, now God starts to speak. Whatever the voice changes. So now, after this declaration of how good God is, how great God is, how wonderful God is, and how magnificently he has taken care of us, now God shows up and he says, because you have set your love upon me, therefore will I deliver you. I will set you on high because you have known and called upon my name. God continues in verse 15, you shall call upon me, and I shall answer you, and I will be with you in trouble. I will deliver you and honor you. And in verse 16, with long life shall I satisfy you and show you my salvation. What a great psalm. I mean, just those 16 verses, how powerfully and how wonderfully they're presented to show us that we can trust God, that we can have confidence in God, that we do not have to fear the figurative night or the literal night, or the figurative day or the literal day, that every way we are covered as we connect with him and his power. So I wanted to share this with you, and what I will do, I'm gonna post this on Facebook and Instagram, hopefully, and get some of these things going. And I can also attach this translation to an email, those of you that I emailed, or if you hear this and you want it, just write me at Duke Clarke. Clarke has an E on it, at gmail.com, and I can send you that as well. So thank you for hanging out this Saturday afternoon, and considering once again the declaration of God that we have nothing to fear and that we can live in that love and peace and joy of life that God has for us no matter what goes on around us. So, thank you for being here, and I will talk to you later.